when you engage your workforce and you say it's not only about cost reduction, really, it's about carbon reduction. People are way more engaged because, cost efficiency is motivating to a certain point. Maybe the CFO will be very motivated but the general workforce is only to a certain extent. But when you say, hey, no, we're really trying to build a more sustainable world, people feel more engaged in that effort.
Engineers, PMs, and designers, this episode's for you. It is so much faster to build software today with the help of Gen AI, as you all know. But that means we're also accumulating more data, more tech debt, and more slop. Unless somebody decides to take a look and do something about it. Today, in my part 2 conversation with Nolwenn Goddard, we dive into 4 real-life use cases. Companies that decided to take action to start measuring. We'll talk about how they did that, what the impact was, and how you can get started yourself. Let's dive into it. Nolwenn, good to see you again.
Happy to be here again. Thank you so much for having me.
Last time we talked, you were telling us about your journey into climate, from starting with your father and then moving into the California state government and working on the Gen AI executive order and the resource limitations. And I'm curious, what's been on your mind since we last talked?
What's been on my mind? How can we influence ESG professionals to embrace AI and vice versa, techies to be more sustainable? What I see is that there is not too much of overlap. Climate people, tech people, AI people, and my dream would be more overlap. So I'm trying to do a lot of education so that people are becoming aware of the impact of AI and as well as the potential of AI for climate impact if we use it well and in an optimized manner.
So tell me more about that, like the lack of overlap there. What are you seeing?
Given that technology, digital, has a huge impact in terms of emission right now, just so that the audience understands, it's about 4% of global emissions. It's going to, about 2030, it's expected to be like 20%.
Wow.
So we need to find ways to reduce that impact. Still, embracing our digital lives. I don't think we're going to, go back to a pre-internet era. But there is so much we can do to optimize and waste less, be smarter about the product we built and the services we built and how we build them, and to minimize the detrimental environmental impact. It's the right time to get our hands into the topic and see what we can do to limit this increase, marginally as much as we can, because we know it's going to scale. So it's really important that if we want to avoid an exponential carbon emission and water impact as mimicking the adoption curve of AI, that we are smarter about reducing the marginal impact of this technology.
So it sounds like folks that are more focused in climate are well aware of these projections and very concerned about it, but maybe they're not in the driver's seat to actually do something about it. And the technologists are building this generative AI, these capabilities, which are really impressive, and they're going to do a lot of good in the world, I hope. Your goal is to drive awareness on both sides to try to help make sure like everybody's kind of coming together. So hopefully this episode will be for those technologists. I'd love to dive into some of the case studies. You have the Climate Product Leaders Playbook that you co-authored, and there are some really amazing real life case studies in there that I'd love to dive into a little bit. I'd love to start with Leboncoin.
Yeah, Leboncoin.
Leboncoin, which is, from what I understand, is kind of like a Craigslist in France. Is that right?
Yes, it's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. Can you tell me what happened there, and what were they seeing, and what did they do to fix it?
Yeah, sure. That's so it was a pretty amazing case. So Leboncoin grew very fast. 85% of about 500 million of weekly API calls were returning 404 error messages. So they were, their APIs were calling, content, messaging placements on banners and things like that.
And 404 is page not found. So they're like making a call, trying to get something back, and nothing's coming back. Yeah.
Exactly.
Dead end.
And they were able to fix that in 2 weeks with one sprint and have a lot of benefits, which I'll go through. But 2 weeks highlights that when you tackle an issue, you can have a big impact for a small effort. You just need awareness and focus and a bit of brainstorming. They were using caching as a solution versus not, so that we don't ask, to retrieve the same information over and over and over again. They got some smart endpoint architecture to verify first, with a smart endpoint if the content existed before asking to retrieve it. And then they did also some dynamic feature management. So being able to turn off a feature that's not needed without having to redeploy the code. They were able to reduce, I think, by 70+% 72% all the API calls. So after...
Wow.
But they had an opportunity to join a competition for an annual challenge on sustainability. And I think then they focus on what they could tackle. And that's how they saw this opportunity, doing a bit more research. This is a typical example of, when you do feature creep, clean up on a regular basis, when you have an organic growth without the discipline of governance, and decommissioning things that are no longer there, like calling some content that disappeared, and not addressing the technical depth, having kind of optimist architecture versus like a smart one that thinks about those problems ahead of time. And then, unfortunately or fortunately, you have invisible inefficiency because the system is still able to perform. And then you get to that stage where waste is really the default. And that's not just, Leboncoin. It's a lot of platforms and products that typically grow fast without the discipline. So sustainability is really nascent, in technology. It's an afterthought. It's not something that people do from the design, from the get-go. Yeah. You have, in many companies, low-hanging fruits. If you tackle your tech debt and you start, putting your nose into those issues, because you're going to find out a lot of waste you can eliminate.
And I imagine that a lot of these, like today, new startups are building even faster than ever before because they have the assist of Gen AI. And so I feel like that's both problematic because there's more chance to be sloppy and like we're just going at all speeds to try to figure out product market fit or grow our customer base or whatever their goals might be. There's often that tension about like, oh, we don't want to slow down to think about these things because we need to like win in our category or, build the business. However, I imagine that it's also maybe easier now to think about these things up front in the design process because of Gen AI. Like you can build that into your initial plan and architecture before you even start launching any code. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think the only issue is that awareness, because if you're aware, you can definitely orchestrate and build from the get-go in a way more cleaner way, in a smarter way. But if you're not aware, what you don't know, you don't know. It's where, but definitely I think AI now is, if you, interrogate your Claude or whatever, they know all of what you're supposed to do to build green software. They've read many books on the topic, so they can help you do that. But you need just to know it exists.
Yeah. So you said that the awareness in this case started with like a sustainability contest of sorts. Do you have any details on what that looked like and how it was brought to light?
It's a contest that is organized by an organization that encourages companies and organizations like public administrations to compete, and every year you have initiatives to reduce your ecological impact and especially your carbon impact of IT systems. When you engage your workforce and you say it's not only about cost reduction, really, it's about carbon reduction, people are way more engaged because cost efficiency is motivating to a certain point. Maybe the CFO will be very motivated, but the general workforce is only to a certain extent. But when you say, hey, no, we're really trying to build a more sustainable world, people feel more engaged in that effort.
I'm really glad you brought that up. That's a really important nuance because I think one of the themes of a lot of people I've chatted with is around like don't upplay the carbon impact, talk about the costs and, the brand and customers and things like that, which works really well, like you said, when you're talking to the CFO or people upstream in leadership. But if you're looking to like invigorate an entire workforce, helping our planet is very compelling and very motivating. So that's a great call out. I'd love to get into Raptor Maps, another case from the playbook. So Raptor Maps is a solar company, which I love that you included in here because they're already a climate company, yet they found that they were not being as sustainable as they could be. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so they also they were victim of their growth from multiple aspects. From the industry growth, solar energy at least a few years ago, and I'm sure it's going to continue, even though the federal administration right now is less supportive, maybe. But exponential growth at the industry level, so scale from that, and also from new technology. They incorporated robots to take imagery and other, sensor, data that typically humans were taking before, and so higher frequency of data collected than when it was by humans. An increase of data that they had to manage. The data was too large to download. They had connectivity issues on the fields, and sometimes they didn't have any connections, performance degradation. So they were quote unquote victim of their success and not able to deal with scale because of the data issue. And so what they did was a few things, redesigning things for the new reality, which was progressive loading. You don't need to load everything up front. Let's load for the main use cases and have summaries. And then people can drill down to the next level of granularity. Or if they're looking for a use case that's not covered, they can still ask for it. But at least you don't load everything up front.
Yeah.
Aggressive caching, they made sure that there would be not twice the same information asked that would be retrieved, but just like everything would be handled by cache. And also think about an offline mobile experience first, offline first, which can be very handy when you're in the field, because many places in solar in panel farms or for other reasons,
right,
agriculture, when you're collecting some data even on your plant and on watering. There are many more use cases in optimization for climate in agriculture as well. You need to be offline first. So they did those changes and they were able to reduce, that's amazing, to reduce their data load by 99% reduction, even more than that, than 25%. So
99%.
They mentioned that they would have saved 1.4 terabytes of installed solar energy. So the daily power saved would be equivalent, so that it speaks to people, to an electric vehicle EV charge for 150 miles.
Yeah.
And then also, we talk about the impact, the environmental impact, but there are many other good benefits for the company as well, like increased engagement, because now people could really use the app and they were happy about it. And then they discover new use cases because of the engagement. And, so it's usually when you do those sustainability reduction efforts, you have many more business impacts as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and this, you mentioned in the playbook too, sustainable by design. This feels like quite a design challenge and effort because, now that we have so much more data accessible to us, it's very compelling and appealing to try to put it all in the app and, just serve as much as we can up to our users and our customers, but being really thoughtful about what they need, when they need it, and the impact on the environment is going to be really critical.
We are opening the door for a lot of inconvenience when we're not super diligent about the data we collect and we keep, and versus purge, etc. Yeah.
What do you mean by inconvenience?
Inconvenience is not the right word, but like risks, data risks, like privacy breaches, cybersecurity issues. The more data you store out there without management, the more you're exposing your customers, you're exposing yourself to big issues. Regulatory impact as well.
Mm-hmm.
You have also regulations. You cannot do everything and anything with data. And the more data you have, the riskier it is. So I think good discipline around data governance is really key. Yeah.
Speaking of governance and redesigns, let's talk about Brussels.
They had an outdated website and they wanted to redesign it, not only so that it is more eco-responsible or more sustainable, but also more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
They decided they would track a number of indicators, new indicators, not just the regular ones we track, customer engagement, all that, but the page size, the load time, the number of requests, transfer bytes. They engage eco-designers, so people who are experts in, sustainable design.
Eco-designers, interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's how we call them in Europe.
Yeah.
Maybe not so,
That's great. I hadn't heard that term before.
And they did first an audit to have a baseline. It's something that many organizations do when they start this work is like, hey, where do I start? It's good to have targets to reduce my emissions and, other KPIs, but where I'm at, is this good, is this bad? And do a benchmark with whomever in your industry if they're already practicing that. And so they had to set up instrumentation. Typically, if you want to measure, you need to first tackle this.
Yeah.
And then they use some tools like GreenSpectre, but there are many other tools, and I will give them to you as resources as well, where you can assess your eco grade, if you want, your eco score of your digital platform. And it assesses multiple criteria and give you a score, and then recommendation on how to improve your score. So you get some ideas on what to do. And then they implemented monitoring tools to be able to track those KPIs. And towards the end, they compared, they audited some pages from before, after, and saw the impact. But basically, they really improved their UX.
Yeah.
And they improved their performance. Of course, decreased their emissions, but also, they transferred much less data, which was good, and fewer HTTP requests. They were able to track all of those KPIs, and they increased their eco scores. The result was a much more usable website.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also what was interesting is that, it's a balance, of course, between the business. I mean, when there is a business, but sustainability and the usability for the users. And when they were iterating their progress, they noticed at some point that the user were a bit confused because their search bar, when they were doing a search, was only returning like the top 5 answers, but users thought it was the exhaustive content, and they got confused. So they iterated on a solution, and actually in a search bar, they mentioned the number of search returns. So, like it's top 5 out of, 250, show more, show all results. But so those are designs like this that you can incorporate.
Yeah, it sounds like they kind of came up with a lot of patterns that other people could learn from to reuse in their own site, because everybody has, search on their website. And also, it seems like, with Brussels and with
Leboncoin.
Yeah. We have a lot to learn from Europe. It's like there's a lot of companies doing really great things there, which is amazing, because then we have patterns we can reuse and pick up right away.
Yeah, that's what I've been noticing, and everyone concur when I'm in those conferences, is that, of course, the US is the leader in software, but Europe is really the leader in sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I'm all about interconnections and overlaps, and say, hey, how can you take the best of software with the best of sustainability and make help everyone on both sides to improve so that they have really good software that is really also really sustainable.
All right, so now let's talk about Mastercard. You talk about this as a flagship example. Tell me what you saw there.
Yeah, so Mastercard, again, GreenIO conference in New York last year, showcased some work they had done, mostly around GreenOps. And really, GreenOps is It's the discipline of looking at your IT operations through the sustainability lens, assess the environmental impact, and decrease it throughout the life cycle of all of your, IT products and services.
So what are you actually measuring?
Yeah, so you would many things, but you would ask yourself questions like, what is the impact of building this application in this region versus another region? What is the impact of our data storage policy? What is the impact of having serverless versus monolithic architecture? You ask yourself these kind of questions. By doing this kind of work, which I will detail, they were able to save $28 million over 2 years, and also cut by 40% their electricity costs.
47%. Wow.
Yeah. So what they did is really first the culture, making a business decision to incorporate GreenOps, not only FinOps or DevOps, into their operation, and start tracking the sustainability data. The concept is that, okay, if you don't need to have some data that needs to run instantaneously, and you can have more in async workloads that you upload at different times of the day, you can be smarter on when and where you do that. So you could have a data center in Texas where there is a lot of wind at night, and you're like, okay, let's run this data, this workload at night in Texas versus, sunny California at noon. A lot of hydraulic power in Montreal, in Quebec. Let's move that here when we develop our, a new large language model that will consume a lot of energy. Let's move that to a very low carbon intensive region in terms of electricity. So you can do a lot of workload balancing, whether it's like time or geography shifts.
Okay.
You can optimize your architecture and your deployment, data strategy, tech setup as well, computerized sizing. So they over provision almost all the time, but if you're smarter, you can reduce your waste, because you run things idle just in case something happens one day. Right sizing is really important. You can also turn off unused instances, which Mastercard did a lot. Auto-scaling and serverless. There were a mix of in-house servers versus cloud computing. Very interesting. Over 60% of their Scope 1 and 2 emissions were coming from their data center. So that was definitely something they could optimize to reduce a lot their carbon emissions. As we mentioned, data compression and also storage tiering, because we tend to have a lot of data, and it takes a lot of data center space, energy, water, all of that to keep that amount of data. And so and reducing waste, duplication, inefficiencies. They also looked at more cleaner, more efficient energy, and also invested in hardware. So not only the data centers, but other hardware, like they change chips. You have different chips can be more or less modern, more or less intensive into energy consumption. So they did all that work, and also they were measuring the power effectiveness and the water effectiveness of the data centers they were using.
Okay.
And all that effort led to those savings.
47% cut in electricity and 28 million in savings over 2 years, I think you said.
Yeah.
You just gave us a lot of information there and a lot of opportunity to go about. It sounds like they were really committed to this effort, and they had a person or a team kind of driving it.
Yeah, they had a team. Yeah, and then they had also some software that they utilized. I've seen a lot of those software, mostly in Europe, but they're coming here too. But they were using Green Pixie, and typically it's software that's super useful for GreenOps.
For people listening, you mentioned GreenOps and FinOps and DevOps. DevOps and FinOps, I think, are maybe more familiar to people. GreenOps is a little bit different. What's the difference? Like, who's the profile of this person, and how do they intersect with? Obviously, they're intersecting with DevOps. What is their thought with the FinOps?
I'm not sure there is a lot of GreenOps in the US, but Mastercard, I mean,
Yeah.
they're global and they didn't mention it GreenOps themselves. They say sustainability for DevOps, but
Okay.
but also with a FinOps.
Like dotted line reporting or something.
Yeah. But in Europe, you see the terms GreenOps used a lot, and it's really again doing the same as FinOps if you want, but with the sustainability lens versus cost. So you look at all your IT, and you're like, how can we optimize so that we reduce? Oh no, so FinOps will be more like cost, but and DevOps is more like all the best practices of managing, all the operations of development. But GreenOps is really sustainable green IT operations. So the lens of sustainability. And not only carbon, but also water and all these other metrics that are impacted, carbon emission, water, and the biggest ones. But you have also materials, as we mentioned last time on the podcast, so
Yeah.
almost a Mount Everest of materials extracted, yearly by 2050. Yeah, so there are a lot to track.
Okay. So if you work at a big company like Mastercard, you might be able to, pull people together and put together this kind of team. If you are a smaller company or a startup, where do you start? Like that's kind of an overwhelming amount of things that we could look at um, to try to
Yeah.
make an impact. Where's the low hanging fruit, and where do you recommend?
Yeah, I would say start learning the language of sustainability, all of what we talked about. And then there's plenty of documentation I'll share with you. But, if you have only just a few to remember, you have the Green Software Foundation. Just go on their website and read all their available resources. You'll learn a lot, and you'll learn enough that you can start the work on your own. Start
Yeah.
simple, and like an audit, establish your baseline, identify small, high impact experiment. Could be like Leboncoin, like, oh, okay, maybe I can just look at, my 4 errors or whatever, like do some targeted audits and see if you can improve things. And then start tracking. I would say start the instrumentation, because without it, you cannot measure anything. And then start measuring. And then when you have a better sense of, oh, okay, this is our baseline, this is where maybe some low-hanging fruit opportunities, then start tracking, build awareness in your company. And maybe also, that's what I like, what I've heard a lot is that in those conferences is that you don't need permission to do great work. Yeah, of course, if you need budget at some point to integrate with a software like WinPixie or others, yes, okay, you'll need to pitch. But otherwise, it's like, oh, am I allowed to save energy? Am I allowed to build better products? Am I allowed to, waste less? No, you don't. Just do great engineering work or great product work, and you'll get to those results. You don't need permission for that. So you can really start on your own, maybe with some colleagues, maybe your manager, but you don't have to talk to the CEO to have permission to improve your operations, basically.
Yeah, you're doing great work. You're doing something that's right for the company, for the customers, for
Yeah.
the planet, and go forward. I think there's also an opportunity here for a lot of startups have hackathons, right? Or
Oh yeah,
you know,
that's such a
so-
good. So thank you so much for bringing it up. That's such a great avenue. Yes.
yeah, right. Get the whole team excited about a short targeted sprint on like where can they find opportunity. Nobody has to ditch their existing roadmap. They're just taking a time for some team building, but also maybe some baselining. You can bring it back another quarter and try to improve some of those opportunity areas. So yeah, a lot of ideas. All right, so let's move on a little bit to water. You talked last time about water and Oregon and the nitrates. If a product manager is listening and they're choosing between like where to cloud regions or infrastructure and how to or engineering, how to host, where to host and what to do, how does water play into that factor?
Yeah, so water is critical and it's hyper local. When data centers come to a region, they consume the local water. There is not circulation of water across the country and say, oh, I'm in California, but I'm going to consume the water of Virginia. No, look, water is local.
Yeah, because I hear the argument, the U.S. has plenty of water.
Yeah, maybe. Who cares if locally I don't? I mean, that's in the mentality of the communities. I live in San Francisco. If tomorrow I say, hey, there is plenty of water in the U.S., but there's going to be none in California for the next few years, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a problem. So it's hyper local, and data centers use a lot of water to cool down, especially the new generation of data centers, the AI data centers. Because, GPUs and TPUs that are specialized chips that are able to run Gen AI, parallel processing, and, able to take on much, much bigger volume of calculations.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, given the amount of calculations they do, heat off much, much more than a regular chip, and so they need cooling. And typically, air cooling is not good enough. For CPUs, it is, but for GPUs and TPUs, it's more water cooling.
Interesting.
We already had water cooling system for data centers, even for the old generation of AI, but it's even more so the problem with the new generation of AI.
Yeah.
And it's so far, it needs to be clean water. If it's wasted water, or it does affect the infrastructure. So it needs to be purified.
So the water's coming in contact with the chips? It's like...
I mean, I'm not that technical, but yes. I mean, there are some technical issues about the water being clean, for sure. And there is some innovation on how to be less reliable on this. But my knowledge on this topic is that, yes, right now, drinkable water is what is used. And so it's in direct competition with the watershed of the local communities.
These data centers are popping up all over the place. And, I was just visiting in Arizona, and we passed by quite a few that were just like sprung up overnight, it seems. That's going to have a massive impact.
Exactly, especially because Gen AI projection say, hey, given the demand that those Gen AI labs are trying to create as well, as so now you need a lot of energy that you didn't need before, and the US grid is not prepared for that. So you need to build more data centers, and then with that you need to cool, and then so you need more water. But the problem with water is that with many industries, or we say, oh, but what about farming? What about golfs? And people playing golfs in the US, the water is recycled and goes back to the aquifer. But in the case of data centers, on average, 80% of the water is evaporated, so it's lost for the local cycle. So once the water is evaporated, it goes. Maybe your local water of Santa Clara is now going to China, So you lose it. You lose it forever. So that's why it's a big problem. It's not recycled.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest difference with nuclear.
I was going to ask, because nuclear takes a lot of water as well. So what's the difference?
Nuclear takes a lot of water as well, but it's recycling. I mean, everything else, it's not evaporated. It's given back to the river or to wherever it releases it. So yeah, water is super important. And also, what I wanted to mention is that we hear a lot of people saying, hey, but now we have a closed loop technology. Most of what we hear people say, about the data center is closed loop is not real closed loop. There's a lot of confusion there. There are two loops. There is one loop that is to cool all the chips and the servers, and that one is closed. But then that water, after it's turned a few times, is released to another loop, and that one gets into evaporation tower. And so ultimately, eventually, the water is getting evaporated. So there are a lot of confusion and miscommunication around this.
Yeah.
It's still at the stage where it's like, recent innovation or in the works. So the time you will need to deploy that to the entire infrastructure is not going to be done overnight. And given the consumption and the adoption of Gen AI is skyrocketing, there are going to be a few years where, there's going to be some tension because the time to have the right proper infrastructure will take time.
I'm curious, how do you use AI yourself? Like you
Yeah,
sit in the middle of this place where you're the technologist and the
yeah.
climate person.
Yeah, so I use it. And I'm a technologist as well. And I really want to be a responsible technologist, but not avoid technology, and also but use it responsibly. So what I do is actually I've downloaded, and I'll share with you the details, a tool called AI Watch that shows me query after query how much energy and emissions and water my
Huh,
impact is of using this technology, so that I'm becoming more and more conscious. I wouldn't say I have a budget yet that I never
yeah.
go over, but I'm building my baseline right now. Like being aware, and then maybe I will have a budget for myself. There are new tools also that are greener, like Green PT in Europe. Built, with all those best practices I mentioned you on 100% clean energy, all of that. So you can use those tools. I
Okay.
have, I'm still like using a few comparing. I have
Yeah.
used Green PT, but also ChatGPT in the past. Now I'm not so much Claude, like Perplexity. I've been, since I was still in an education phase, I was still comparing and seeing where I will land. But then
Hmm.
eventually I will probably do one choice.
Hmm.
But I would say for me, it's like using it for good purposes. I don't create videos. There is super, I mean, unless I had maybe, in the future, a real business needs to do that. But I
Right.
don't create videos for my entertainment with Jenna.
Yeah. No
It's
flying
consuming
cats.
so much.
Yeah.
No flying cats,
Hmm.
no.
Yeah.
But more for research, when I want to investigate a topic and want to have access to a lot of resources I can read. I would ask a Gen AI tool, hey, give me all the research and maybe some counter pointers and arguments, counter arguments, help me. I'm thinking this of this topic. How, what else am I missing? Like, to
Yeah.
refine my thinking and have more resources so I can do more research and be more educated about the topic, then I hope having a bigger impact. So I'm trying to leverage those tools for a good outcome versus, things that are useless. I have a salad and an egg in my fridge. What can I do tonight? That I don't think are
Yeah.
good uses of Gen AI.
Yeah.
Um, and then also I would say, we have a overall balance. Sometimes you're like, okay, I'm going to use AI more, but you know what? I'm doing other choices in my life. I don't have any car. I don't eat meat.
Mm.
I use public transportation. I'm mostly vegetarian. Like you have many things you can play with
Yeah.
your impact,
That's a great point.
to reduce your impact.
A lot of people I talk to have this eco anxiety that weighs on them, and you're seeing it. You're diving into it to see, like
Yeah.
with AI, one of the most consumptive areas we have right now. How do you take care of yourself?
So I do exercise and I start my day in nature. I'm lucky. I'm very lucky. I live close to a body of water. So I swim in the
Mm.
bay every morning. I start my day like this. And so you see the pelicans, you see the seals in water. And then
Yeah,
I also invest a lot in community friendships, and I make sure I nurture those friendships and I see my friends on a very, very regular basis. And
yeah.
one more thing as well that I think is true for me, but for a lot of people who are in the climate sphere is action versus like say, hey, there's
Mm,
nothing you can do. We're all gonna die. No, being in action, even if it's small, but you have an impact.
right.
So being vocal, maybe have a conversation about climate, or maybe do something around climate, transform an aspect of your work for climate.
Yeah.
Then I think it can also reduce anxiety
And
there.
if you're listening and you don't have anybody to talk to about that and you feel alone or scared, feel free to reach out to me. And I'm sure, Nolan, you would also
Yeah,
welcome people to reach out to you to chat and think about how they might be able to take action.
definitely.
Thank you so much. The playbook has a wealth of information. I'll be sure to link it. But if people are just listening, where do they find it?
So on climateproductleaders.org,
Great.
and yeah, we have a page on the playbook, a page for all the use cases, and soon to be, we'll have courses. We're working on those. So,
Oh, good.
yeah,
Yes. Great. Nolwenn, thank you so much. As always, I really appreciate you coming back and chatting with us some more and telling us about these use cases.
thank you so much for having me.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Nolwenn reminds us that we don't need permission to do great engineering work. We spend so much time waiting for leadership approval, or waiting for a regulation or policy mandate, or waiting for someone else to go first. But the companies we talked about today didn't wait. They spotted what was wrong, they took action, and they had an impact. So if your code base is growing fast, or your data retention policy is to keep everything, or if you've never asked how much water consumption your cloud region is having, then check out the playbook. It's in the description. It might just be a 2-week sprint, and you can have a massive impact. And if you missed my first conversation with Nolwenn, you can see it here. I'm Louisa Henry, and this is Any Job Can Be a Climate Job.